So we'll get on with World Watchers, and if you want to contribute, that's fine. Just let the station know. Reach is waiting for you. He's anxious to hear if you want to contribute to the station. P.O. Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950. And this is Mae Brussell, and this is KZU, K-A-Z-U, in Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.
Do you hear the card on? I put it on, and I swear I do not hear it each week. When it plays later at the end of the program, but there's something on the board here that doesn't work for me, not like it should. And I hear the clock outside, and it's 8 o'clock. And this is Mae Brussell, and it is broadcast number 625, November 28, 1983. Another one of those months that has rolled away. They go pretty fast, don't they? I usually begin by describing the events that took place last year, and oh my goodness, what happens in November each year just seems to be tremendous. There's always a big story. The story last year was the Vatican Bank, how the Vatican got itself implicated in the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. That was just last year in the Wall Street Journal, and the accounts of the tangled money of the bank with Milan, with the offices in Milan that were busted. The import-export agency Stibam, S-T-I-B-A-M, the International Transport Company, and the interlocking links of Milan to Banco Ambrosiano to New York to Liechtenstein. And it had to do with drug dealers, international gangs of arms dealers, illegal exports to Iran and to Middle East countries from Europe, military hardware traded mainly for heroin sold in Europe, run by Henry Arsan, 70 years old, from Syria, with an Italian wife. Their offices were in the Banco Ambrosiano building, and the bust took place last November, and it was in June that Roberta Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, who worked with the Vatican, was found murdered in London. So from June until November, this story was surfacing, and then the arms and the drugs linked not only to Roberta Calvi but to the Vatican Bank. And at that moment, the Pope brought in Mr. Hermann Abst. He worked for him during World War II. The Pope worked for Solvay Chemical, which is IG Farben, and Hermann Abst was on the board of IG Farben, the head of the Deutsche Bank in Germany. He wrote the paychecks for Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler, and he was brought in to the Vatican to help find or replace the $1.2 billion that was missing from the dummy fronts in the Bahamas and in Panama. They've never yet come up with much about that money. It's still secret. This was a year ago that these stories were breaking. In the last year, a new Jesuit priest would replace the other one. The Jesuits were getting too liberal. Mr. Abst has got the Pope to crack down on all priests who are doing liberal church work. You can be a fascist like Lech Walesa. You can fight communism, but you can't fight poverty or social repression. And in the United States, the Pope has some big appointments to make. And Mr. Hermann Abst is working with the Vatican. In the past year, I learned that he actually was the head of Opus Dei. That's the lay organization that raises funds for business people, very, very conservative, secret organization. And it turns out in this last year that Hermann Abst is the head of the Opus Dei, and the Opus Dei has as its head the man who wrote the paychecks for the entire Nazi operation, and now works in the Vatican for the Pope, who worked for him at Auschwitz for IG Farben. It was Solvay Chemical. Those stories were breaking just a year ago, and of course they're still unresolved, except that Abst is still there. The new Jesuit priest has taken over, and he's more stringent. There is no revealing, and never will be, of where the money went, the dummy fronts. the Vatican money that disappeared out of Panama, if it's funding fascism, Nazism, oppression, or whatever, there's no indication of where that money went or what it's used for. Now, the Rebel is out. We talked about that earlier on the first part of this program. You can get the Rebel around the United States, wherever you get these tapes. There's a city, I'm sure, where you can get it. If you're somewhere where you can't get it, I'll get a copy for you. If you're a long listener to World Watchers, that's the prerequisite. You have to be a long member of World Watchers, 5 years or more. And I'll send you I said I would for the holidays anyway. If you can't obtain it, a lot of people are obtaining it. Larry Flynt sent out broadcast number 617 and 618. I told you that to every member of Congress. He spent $6,000 for that. And for the first time in my 20 years research, I got a telephone call from the member of the Congressional Committee from a particular office in Washington, D.C. First we didn't get any answer from the congressman. Mr. William Proxmire sent his back and said he doesn't listen to tapes. But Leon Panetta, our congressman, wrote to me and said if I can be of any more assistance. So that meant there were like 518 that didn't answer. But one of them that I didn't get a direct letter from, and I won't mention his name because something may happen between now and when I meet with the Congressional Committee. I'm very superstitious about telling these things in advance because something funny happens on the way to getting the truth out. Some representatives from Washington, D.C. will be with me, thanks to a particular congressional committee, and I think I owe this to Larry Flynt, to discuss the Nazis in power, the Nazi war criminals that have passed themselves off as not being criminals. And I think you know that I'm after the man behind Henry Kissinger, his mentor, Fritz Kramer, and being as he won't answer my letter, and I've collected enough books and time on this, maybe it's time for this man to take an oath in front of Congress that he is not the Fritz Kramer that was in the docket as prisoner 33, and he was not Hitler's Fritz Kramer. If he was, he should get the heck out of this country, and we should defrock Henry Kissinger, who's the biggest disease going. We worry about AIDS or pneumonia or heart attack or cancer. I want to do a little more on Henry Kissinger. There is a congressional committee that is sending somebody to the House. When it's over, I will tell you about it. I will tape record it so that I know what I said to them. That's a tricky thing. They come out and then report some nondescript thing. The Secret Service did that, came to my house, and I tape recorded what I said, and they wrote up their report, what I said, and they were two entirely different reports. So you can send for one from Freedom of Information. So when they come, I assume it's on good faith, so I will record it and ask for a report of it, and we'll see what happens from there. That's a good step. That's a giant step in the right direction. It would make all of this time and work valuable to have this person testify under oath who he is. Now, if you have questions about Larry Flynt in the news, I appreciate your concern. Don't call the House. I'm not responsible for his failures. I use the word, maybe that's a psychological slip. He's in trouble. Deep trouble. I would like to advise him before he gets into that kind of stuff, but I don't know him that well. I didn't know him at all until this September when I said I would do a story on Larry McDonald because they were deifying him, and before the Pope came in and made him a saint, I wanted to show a little bit about Larry McDonald. I'm not responsible for the behavior of Larry Flynt or the people that surround him. I can suggest ways to extricate him. I can suggest lawyers to help him. There's pretty powerful forces around there, and they seem to negate any common sense. They can't be in his best interest, but I can't step into an area like that and influence him the way I think. He did admit this afternoon, I talked with him, that certain advice I gave was the right advice and he didn't take it. That can be very costly and painful, and why he didn't take it, I don't know. He's got these other people around, bigwigs, who give the wrong advice and you take it because you think they're your friend. And the meanwhile, they're sinking you or nailing you to the cross, whatever it is. And if you can't distinguish, and some people really can't, then they have to, take the consequences of the bad judgment. There's problems at Rebel. There's a person there who is not living up to his word or promise. I don't know what will happen there. I'm not going to sacrifice anything in the terms of honesty or consistency with what I'm doing. There are people in there that would like to sabotage Mae Brussell and get her mad so that maybe she leaves or discredit her. And I'm just going to continue what I have to do and keep up my relationship with Larry Flint if I can and let him give them orders. As I said, I never knew him before September 1983. And I'm not going to sacrifice. I'll just go back doing what I was doing before I met him, which was doing radio work and writing and accumulating material for articles and books. And when you meet somebody who wants to go with a story, you then have the material. I work just as hard, whether it's for him or I'm on my own. I never did stop the work because I don't consider it work. I like it. So don't call the house and day by day and want an account of why he's doing this or where he is, because I'm not responsible for him, and I just have enough time to keep up with what I'm doing, and I can't explain all the things that are going on there. I understand them at a level that makes it almost inevitable that these things should happen to him, but I can't extricate him alone because, as I say, he's surrounded, and there are liars around him and people who are not truthful, who have lied to me, and I know they lie to Larry and are not looking out for his interests. But when you're big, when you're rich, when you think you've got it made, and when you're controversial, they step in and squash you like a little bug. And the answer is don't get so big and don't get so outlandish and go slow. And as I say, I'm an existential in that term. I don't want a big marquee and a lot of fame, and I don't want to be with people necessarily who are doing the moving and shaking, because they're not that valuable to society, most of them anyway. Most of the changes are made in quiet places by quiet people thinking things through, and people like George Seldes, I keep using his name, doing monumental work all of his life, exposing fascism at his own pace. This is much more rewarding than to be with a few people for a few moments and then find out that they're infiltrated with people who are betraying you and lying with you. And luckily I can leave that scene. That's one reason I'm up in Carmel away from LA. I don't like the scene of a lot of people in some big cities in this country and the way they operate. Now, I'm doing another story for the Rebel. I assume there'll be another issue. And that is going to be on the Grenada invasion, 3 areas, the total blackout of the press, actually 4 areas. The unprecedented news blackout that I've talked about on this program, the questionable and interesting medical school and the people involved in it, Dr. Jeffrey Bourne and Peter Bourne and their past, and this Mr. Modica who set it up, the mental hospital that was bombed, and the consequences, the secrecy of it, and what I think took place, and the similarities between Grenada, the government there that existed before Mr. Bishop, the similarity to Mr. Burnham in Guyana, although one was a Marxist and the other was an outright dictator. The similarities of them, their work with our State Department, the CIA, and the similarities between Jonestown and what happened in Grenada. And they're not only close physically in proximity, but there are a lot of similarities between the 2 operations. The Grenada being the medical school and the mental hospital, and over nearby the People's Temple in Jonestown. So I'm doing that story, and it should be in the mail and on its way tomorrow. The New Times, which is a magazine, it's a weekly magazine that comes out from the Soviet Union, has an article about CIA Director William Casey, and they were talking about his activities getting a reward in the CIA along with Richard Helms this last week for great behavior. And they had an interesting sentence in this article about Casey. It said, it looks like it was in Casey's office that the idea of landing troops in Grenada was first discussed. The operation, which began with the bombing of, in quotes, a highly important strategic objective, a hospital. Okay? So I know I'm on the right track. I said that Casey got rewarded after the hospital was bombed for his great service and wiping out. It had a patient number of 180 people, and I go into the mass graves and the missing account and bodies being thrown out to sea and being dug up on the orders of Americans, and how the press was put off. And the book, The Children of Jonestown by Kenneth Wooden, there's a section in the book that refers to a man who worked for the National Security Council by the name of Robert Pastor, Pastor, and he was on the staff of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And in the book Children of Jonestown, it says that the national security was involved, and there was an impulse to save any possible embarrassment to the Carter administration. So therefore, on orders from the Carter administration and Mr. Pastor, they removed the identification tags of people that they knew had identities. And Mr. Cobb, one of the people talking about this, said 2 members of his family were identified. He said, my brother, Johnny Cobb, saw tags on the people's bodies, and only 2 members of my family have been identified, and I want to know why, because they took them off. And in the book, The Children of Jonestown, it says that there were orders from high up that all politically sensitive papers and forms of identification were removed from the corpses, so that these ID tags were taken off of people and put into mass graves. And there's a quotation of a Lieutenant General Gordon Sumner, who said that it was the first time in his military career that he saw his men politicized, and that Robert Pastor was working for Brzezinski and President Carter's national security to save the Carter administration from embarrassment. The identity of the bodies was removed. Now, at the time of Grenada, when the U.S. Army was planning to invade it, 2 of Jimmy Carter's top aides were telephoned by Dr. Jeffrey Bourne. He was the vice chancellor of the medical school at Grenada, and he called his son Peter Bourne in Washington, who worked with Jimmy Carter. And after Mr. Bishop, Maurice Bishop, was murdered in Grenada, General Hudson Austin, Austin, he's the ringleader of the group that killed Maurice Bishop, and his assistants were working with Mr. Bourne from the medical school, and they called to Washington, D.C. to Robert Pastor. He was a former senior Latin American policy planner for the National Security Council, and told Pastor and Dr. Peter Bourne that there was no danger to the medical school, that the students were being taken back and forth to classes, and that the medical school was perfectly willing to work with General Hudson Austin, didn't want America interfering, and they were working with the same Robert Pastor who took the ID tags off the people at Jonestown. So when Ronald Reagan insisted on invading the island, I believe that the secrecy of keeping the press off the island for 5 days was then to have to kill everyone in the mental hospital, because this time it involved mind control. They were protecting Ronald Reagan's administration, and last time they were protecting Jimmy Carter's. So there may be important witnesses to trials in the United States, or people we're looking for, who were patients in that hospital who had to be bombed. And Mr. Pastor, the same fellow that worked with Brzezinski, and Carter, was now working with Peter Bourne and Jeffrey Bourne and the people that had killed Mr. Maurice Bishop. So evidently that mental hospital went on under Sir Eric Gary, and when the medical school was formed in 1977. When Bishop was in power, evidently it was okay to have the mental hospital going. And the one thing that they didn't want was the United States troops to come in any more than they wanted Representative Leo Ryan to go into Jonestown. So it's my belief, based on a lot of secrecy and the simultaneous calls of these various people to each other, synchronized to the top people that worked during the Jonestown operation, this time in Grenada. And when the president made up his mind he was going to go through with the invasion, he obliged with Caspar Weinberger of keeping the journalists off until at least the target of the hospital was bombed. And as I say, New Times said that the big operation of the CIA was to target the mental hospital, which is exactly consistent with the research that I've done. Now, the San Jose Mercury had a story this last week. Kissinger makes comeback. Ex-Secretary of State's influence is growing. He's making a strong comeback, and there's a quotation of a friend of Henry Kissinger. Henry hasn't changed. He wants to run the world. Henry's name began to surface right after the Alfred Bloomingdale tapes were silenced and Vicki Morgan had her head split open. 2 weeks later, he was back in power. Kissinger headed that Kissinger-Carrington Association that had headquarters in Barbados, that was the organizer or the pretext for invading Grenada. There were two main pretexts. One was that the organization of the various unaligned states, the small states in the Caribbean, needed to come in because the bishop was a threat, and when the coup took place, Mr. Cord was a threat, and we had been planning the invasion for 4 years. Well, Henry Kissinger is everywhere. He's in the Middle East. He's in Latin America, Central America, South America, all over the world. And he will someday, as I say, be president. He's working for the president. He's in making foreign policy. He's the foreign policy guru to the Republican president, and you just can't wash him away. The only way we'll get him, I sincerely believe, is to get to Mr. Fritz Kramer and find out who Henry Kissinger really is. I believe that sincerely. I said several years ago that, and kept on this subject, that he is a disease, and I would like to see him removed. And so we have to just keep working on this. He wants to be in power, as his friend says. He wants to have total power, and that's the important thing. Now, once the Grenada invasion took place, and I'm just going to mention a couple more things on Grenada, there was a story in the Houston Post on bringing in the U.S. Army. It says the U.S. Army general in charge of the troops in Grenada said the future role of the U.S. Army on the island would be to build a police force that would prevent any leftist revolutionaries from ever again seizing power on that island. Brigadier General Jack Farris, F-A-R-R-I-S, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, that's the Special Forces, the Green Beret from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He said the United States has already brought in sophisticated computers that will be used to register and keep track of the island's remaining leftists with the help of an extensive police intelligence system to be built by the Americans. There's 100,000 people on the island. The Libyans were sent home. The Russians were sent home. The Cubans were sent home. And now a sophisticated computer will keep track of the remaining leftists, and some of them were put into cages. There was an article about the repressions going on there of the American troops saying, okay, you took the island because you wanted democracy, and they were keeping people crawling on their hands and knees into the various cages and humiliating them and taking away a lot of their rights. There was another story in the Washington Times. The administration says other Grenada-style actions are possible. Yes, they are possible, and Mr. Weinberger and Howard Baker and the others can say there's little doubt that they wouldn't move militarily again. This is like the Anschluss of Adolf Hitler through Europe. There's no way, I can't see any way, to stop Reagan from doing what he wants. He was noticeable when he was the governor of this state. He hasn't changed at all, and now we're really getting what he promised us then, and the chickens are coming home to roost. So the computers are down there, and the rest will be history, how far they go in every other country. The New York Times had a story on Grenada aftermath, November the 7th, and it tells about George Shultz, and it said in different weeks, he's taken on new authority in recent weeks. Mr. Shultz and the State Department as a whole, backed by Vice President Bush and James Baker, they're meeting once a week as they never did before, and Mr. Shultz is emerging as a strong man in the State Department. And then it says from this is the New York Times, this was the most thoroughly planned crisis I've ever participated in, an experienced American diplomat said of the American-led invasion of Grenada. Lebanon does not have an endgame. Grenada does. In, out, and over. This was the most thoroughly planned crisis. Remember how it was just by chance that Mr. Bishop was shot and we had to come in and save the people? Someone from the Pentagon is describing it exactly as it was and how it was. And, of course, Mr. Shultz works with the entire Nixon administration in various offices, and he's from Bechtel Corporation with Mr. Weinberger. And along with Henry Kissinger, they've been long friends. So they have this thing pretty well tied up. There have been some stories I haven't been able to update the last few weeks on the Civil Liberties Union suit in Los Angeles, that famous police department suit that linked to Larry McDonald and Western Goals. Western Goals is in every major city with its computers identical to the ones they're putting on Grenada to test getting rid of the leftists. Keep in mind that this is a small island of 100,000 where they invaded it without one member of the press for the first time in American military history. Now they're bringing in their computers and deporting various people away from the island who had a right to live there, just sending them out of the country, just as Adolf Hitler would do, saying, get out, we'll put you on a plane, you've got to get out. Now, this kind of behavior is run by computers. It will be computerized, and the Civil Liberties Union in Los Angeles is trying, through their lawsuit, to talk about what went into the computer of Western goals run by the Defense Department that goes into Germany to Galen's BND Corporation and to Edward Teller and Admiral Moore, the military, and Roy Cohn of the Mafia. The ACLU suit is just one city where there's a lawsuit. The others have their Western goals computers with police departments, and because there's no lawsuit, we don't get the information. But there was one article in the Los Angeles Herald this week. The city, Los Angeles, will give the ACLU police transcripts on the condition that they're kept secret. They're ready to turn over transcripts of their private police interviews with Jay Paul, who worked for Western Goals and had that $100,000 computer. Fred Bennett, an attorney with Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, insisted that they only belong for a limited or few people in the trial, then they have to be kept secret forever. Now, Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher is the law firm from William French Smith that he uses, and it's Ronald Reagan's law firm, and on these tapes, there's information about the time period when Ronald Reagan was breaking law as the governor of California. Jay Paul, formerly of the disbanded Public Disorder Intelligence Division, is a key figure in the allegations that the files were improperly used or removed. And the police department fought for the turnover of the tapes, and they said this is a terrible precedent for future personnel investigations. To let you hear what we're doing, they said it would have a devastating impact on internal affairs operations. This is like 1984. If we tell you what we did in the past, it will affect future operations. We can't scold you about the past because then it'll affect what we're going to do in the future. That law firm of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, Mr. Bennett, is asking the judge to limit the access of the transcripts to the plaintiffs, just to their lawyers, and then lock them up again. And the ACLU lawyer, Paul Hoffman, who's carrying the brunt of this whole case, said the public has a very important need to know what's in the material. And he's fighting. The trial's supposed to start December the 5th, and he's fighting to get that information out to us. Now, there was another article on the restriction of these police tapes, which is interesting because of the language. And the law offices are working with the police department to keep the information top secret. And the LA Times had a story. 131 groups and individuals have sued. They've charged illegal spying. And they are, this is quotes, not entitled to waltz off with something as a gift. This is what the judge said, Lester E. Olson. These people can't waltz off with a gift. He said there's no such thing as a free lunch, and they don't need to know what's on these tapes. These tapes have information. They can use it for trial preparation, but it should be locked up. Now, if you have other litigation, if you want to file with the police department, you can get it later. Judge Olson ordered that the ACLU begin receiving summaries of the tapes, and they will be given a few of the transcripts starting December and January. The disputed transcripts represent more than 250 hours of interviews with Jay Paul, who worked with Western Goals, and they have to do with 180 boxes of intelligence that went to his home and garage with the Birch Society president and this fascist with his links to the Nazis around the world in Chile and George Habash in Lebanon and so forth. He is limited to what he has to tell them, and then it's locked up. Another 1984 argument was by the police department was that in future internal probes, this would foster police corruption. If the police today knew what the police were doing in the past, it would cause police corruption today. So this was an interesting tug of war in court last week, and they don't want the people who have the lawsuit to waltz off with a gift. With that kind of mentality of Judge Olson, you can imagine there's no such thing as a free lunch. The 131 groups and individuals have been bugged, wiretapped, have their privacy invaded, their sex life, their politics, whether they have abortions or priests or rabbis. All that is in these computers, what they do, what their family does. But they're talking about this great gift, this free lunch, if you give them too much information. Incidentally, I had a shock this weekend, a mini shock, but a young fellow who works for somebody in our family, he's trained at the LAPD, and sometimes he wants to be in the FBI. So just in conversation, I said, what would you do if you were working for the agency and you found out, say that they lied on a particular homicide case, if there were more bullets, I was thinking of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, that were in the body, and you knew it, and they said there were 2 bullets and there were 8 or 6, what would you do? And he said, I'd cover it up. I said, you're going into the FBI and you would cover up a homicide if they wanted you to cover up? He said, yeah, he would cover it up. The years of idealism are over, I guess, when people join an agency admitting that they would destroy evidence or lock up evidence in these matters is here. This is what we have to face. And this is a young person, a nice person, and he was very honest. I'd just cover it up. We'll take a 1-minute break now and then get back to the second part of this program. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you I asked you in between to give to the station and send in money. This is a fundraising week. You can donate. If you didn't hear me the first part and you just turned on World Watchers, you can contribute to the station if you want. It's appreciated. And send in a little bit if you don't have a lot. That's fair, isn't it? I always say send in a little. If you don't have a lot, send in a little and share with everybody, and we'll all get the program and a lot of other programs going at the same time. Now, this is Pledge Week, so we're going to do a lot of that this week and next week, but I usually do it anyway because I sincerely believe that people should contribute to these things and help out, and everybody do a little bit, right? Okay. You promise you'll do that? Okay, this is Mae Brussell, and this is side 2 of broadcast number 625, November 28th, 1983. This is side 2. If I sound tired, I'm exhausted. It's been a really hard week. I went down to L.A. for Thanksgiving. I drive there and back, and my head gets scrambled. It's a real culture shock to be down there, and when I come home, it takes me about 3 or 4 days to get used to being back in nice Carmel and get away from some of that thinking down. It's really hard to live in the big city. I don't suppose everyone is like that, but the people I'm with, it's hard to appreciate how little they're involved in wanting to know what's going on in the world. I guess I'm in a cocoon here because everyone I talk to is concerned about world events and concerned, or I'm not talking to them. And so it reinforces your energy level, and when you're down there, it's always negatives, or how do you believe this, or do you think people really care, will the truth ever be told? And it's the blah blahs that I'm sure a lot of you get around your family and friends, and I change my friends, and I only see certain members of the family occasionally, and some of the stuff I have to listen to, but most of the time I'm reading new material and meeting new people and working with people who are sending articles and books, and a lot of information came in this week while I was away. I'll get around and thank you next week, or I'll thank you right now on the air. But I get my energy up here, and it takes me a day or two when I get back to get it straight. There was an announcement on national television this week about the Korean airline. We haven't updated that. Melvin Belli, who has law offices right here in Pacific Grove, about 2 blocks from the station, as well as in San Francisco, you know, Melvin Belli, I mentioned him in the Rebel article, my last article. He's representing some people who were on the Korean, had members of their family in the Korean airline that was shot down by the Soviet Union, and he claims that the pilots were paid the secret bonuses, and the excuse he gives was to save fuel, but that the Korean airline passengers were flying into the Soviet Union because they didn't take adequate precautions, and that if they saved the fuel, they were given extra money. And originally they said that was the fuel story. Well, that makes sense for some people. He's representing member family of Muriel Cole of New York, who was killed in the crash. I threw out the idea of the fuel saving just briefly in the article I did that'll be coming out this next week, the February issue of Hustler. It's one thing to want to save fuel, and I don't doubt that the Korean airline went straight over parts of the Soviet Union territory if it wanted to save fuel. That would be expedient, and they do it all the time. But with the effort that the other planes met them with and said, get out, or go down or turn around or land and no response, I don't believe that you could pay a pilot that kind of money to commit suicide. And he didn't respond. And what I wrote about was that he was in a kamikaze state of mind, according to the transcripts, it seems, and the other two we never heard about, although they're well-known pilots, so they probably were asleep or murdered. So that one pilot carried the load and he went straight into the territory, even though it was certain death, and he didn't appear to be frightened. Now, when you are using up fuel or saving fuel, you can pay a guy, a few $1,000s to save fuel or whatever the fee, but you just don't go right into the sunset of death to save gasoline for the Korean airline. So that doesn't make sense. But that's one of the cover stories, like saying the Kennedy assassination was done by the Cubans and Fidel Castro. If you have to cover up a CIA operation where you're going to sacrifice Larry McDonald, you say the pilots were paid because of the fuel. Now, I believe the pilot was paid extra money to do what he did, but I also think he was under some kind of control. After I wrote that story, somebody who read it, who's working with me, read the story and wasn't aware that there was much talk of kamikaze, actually, since the last war, World War II. And since then, there's been a lot of talk about the kamikaze person that was smiling, that ran into Lebanon with the ammunition and blew up the American embassy there. And there's talk about a possible kamikaze over Washington, D.C., the Capitol building. That would be equivalent to Hitler's Reichstag to take over the United States government, an excuse. I know that we have a whole farm of kamikaze people that the CIA has trained and read enough books on mind control that you don't perfect that program for nothing. And the perfect way to take control of any government is to have some kind of disaster. And I believe that the Red Scare that happened right at the time of the Korean airline disaster indicated, as far as I could see, several months ago when I wrote the article, that the guy was under some kind of mind control. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. There were 4 events that took place, just 1, 2, 3, 4, that made Ronald Reagan look like the great master and warrior, along with George Shultz. And one was the airline that went down, and their prepared speeches. They had to be in the can and prepared about the Larry McDonald plane going down. Right after that was the Burma shootout, and the officials of the South Korean government, with no trial or no explanation at all that they were North Koreans. They haven't come up with a shred of evidence or a single person to say they were North Koreans, even though it was a provocateur kind of action. Then the plans to go into Grenada that George Bush sat in on October the 14th. Mr. Maurice Bishop wasn't murdered until the 19th, and there was no martial law at the time. And they were ready to move quickly into there for the largest military operation since the Vietnam War. And then I have articles I brought in here about the foreknowledge of the plans for the blowing up of the building in Lebanon that left several hundred Marines dead. So we had 4 quickie mini military operations that made Ronald Reagan on the news, that made him look strong. And then the polls say he's a great leader. I don't know who's answering the questions of the polls, but I felt that all 4 were provocateur operations to keep us off our guard. And pretty soon we'll have another one. There has to be one medical case where somebody needs a kidney or a spare part, and then it alternates with a crisis that later turns out to be instigated by the CIA. But the adrenaline seems to need it, the newscasters seem to need it, and the beat goes on and on. But it was interesting that Belli, who's worked for the CIA all his life, comes out with a story that the pilots were paid extra money to take this particular flight. People's World had a marvelous article by Con Hallinan. I think he's the son of the well-known attorneys in San Francisco, the Hallinan family. It's called 007 Revisited, and this was written November the 12th, 1983. The airplane, the 007, went down September the 1st, so this is 6 weeks later. And the gist of the article, he says, even though it's 2 months past since the Korean airline went down, the Reagan administration suddenly went silent over the entire incident. Piece by piece, the real picture of what happened that night over the North Pacific is dribbled out. And the more facts that surface, the more deeply they entangle the administration in the deaths of the 269. Now, this is interesting because next week my article will be out, and I wrote that within 3 weeks of the deaths, or 2 weeks of the time that the plane went down. I worked night and day, and 2 months later, this story just sort of backs up exactly what I was saying, where the administration is in trouble. It says that it is now clear that the White House deliberately distorted the tapes played during the United Nations debate on the incident and made no effort, when they said the Soviets made no effort to contact the 007, and once the tapes were removed from the clutches of Gene Kirkpatrick, it turned out that the plane had made several efforts by radio and fired tracers as a warning below and behind the plane, making the precise identification impossible. And what is clear, it took place while the United States was involved in a series of intelligence gathering operations. In other words, the Soviets were telling the truth. They didn't know it was a passenger plane. They thought it was a hostile intrusion, which it was. These conclusions were reached by the United States, Japanese intelligence communities, and delivered to the White House before September 14th. That's 2 weeks after the death. In short, the administration has been lying all of this time. The question is, how far do the lies go? And what was 007 doing? And this gets back to Grenada or the other current events, too. This administration has lied completely down the line, and they're asking what they were doing. The CIA gave a report by John KEPPEL, who leveled devastating charges at the Reagan administration over the incidents. KEPPEL is one of their good old boys, a man whose curriculum reads like a dime-storage spy novel. He's from Harvard graduate. He's a man who's now exposing the 007 for the fraud that it was, trying to blame the Soviets for what happened. He's from Harvard, cum laude, a class of 1940. That's just before Pearl Harbor. He was a World War II hero with the Bronze Star and Oak Leaves Cluster, the Croix de Guerre. He spent his time in the State Department. He moved to the CIA in 1958. His rap sheet is long and impressive. He was in action from 1948 to 1950 in Moscow and in Frankfurt during the first major post-war crisis between the United States and Russia. Then he moved to Korea. He headed up the embassy's political division during the Korean War, so he knows his territory. He's considered a Soviet expert. He managed to be top political officer in Brazil for 2 years prior to the 1964 military coup. That's right after John Kennedy was killed. There was a coup down there. He had 5 years with the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. He's written up in Julius Mader's Who's Who in the CIA on page 280. He's a big fish. And the article says, why this credential list? Because John KEPPEL knows his business, and he's released an independent study of Korean airline 007 that said not only was the plane on an intelligence gathering mission initiated by the United States, but virtually inescapable conclusion drawn from the evidence that the principal purpose of the flight was to provoke an atrocity by the Soviet Union. This is written by Con Hallinan about a man who's worked in the system, and he said this administration provoked an atrocity. KEPPEL reaches his rather startling conclusions through a detailed analysis of virtually every factor involved in the flight, figuring them all into a games theory improbability and a coincidence chart. Now that's interesting for those of you taking the tape and listening to this broadcast. Go out and get the February Hustler, because I have about 15 or 20 points about the aeroplane going into it. I'm not Harvard cum laude, no Croix de Guerre, no State Department, no work in Moscow or Frankfurt or Korea, but I'm pretty proud that I could figure it all out myself within 2 weeks. And I think this is something for those of you who are listening, whether you're young or old, because I only started my research when I was 40 years old and never did it before. But you really can figure these things out. There's no intelligence community feeding me information. I just buy the newspapers and read them, and I have no funding like the large spy systems. Nobody is behind me except me, my little newspapers, and the time I spend cutting and reading. And I'm able to figure out, and you can too. That is the important thing. It's not a big mystery who is doing the lying and the pushing and shoving. So the conclusions here that he has are exactly the way I figured it came down. This article says what is compelling about KEPPEL's argument is his detailed knowledge of the nuts and bolts of spy work, coupled with his experience in the politics of the U.S. intelligence community. The ex-CIA man is presently attempting to get Congress to look to the facts in the KAL. Pardon me 1 minute. There's somebody in here. I want her to leave. No, I'm taping this. Would you leave, please? Right now. I don't have people in the studio when I'm doing this because It's broadcast for other stations, and it picks up sound, so when somebody comes in, I chase them right out. Thank you. I don't appreciate rustling of paper or albums here because I'm concentrating with you. You're getting my undivided time. And whoever comes on next has to wait till 9 o'clock. Okay? Now, this article says this ex-CIA man wants Congress to look at the facts in the KEPPEL case because he argues it would be dangerous to leave the questions unresolved and thus to acquiesce to the construction of the Reagan administration and what they have put on the matter. Let me repeat this again. He is going into this, and he wants Congress to look at the facts of the KEPPEL case because it would be dangerous to leave the question unresolved and thus to acquiesce in the construction that the Reagan administration has put on the matter. Now, if we go into the KEPPEL and the airline 007, you go into the Lebanon provocations, and if you were to go into the Grenada mental hospital and medical school or the killings in Burma of the South Korean officials, if you took those four in your lifetime, you may be able to find Henry Kissinger and Lord Carrington and Daniel Graham and also the Los Angeles police story breaking. We don't have to go back to who killed Kennedy to fight fascism, but you surely will get fascism if you don't take heed to some of these warnings. What he's saying is that you have to stop Ronald Reagan on this matter. KEPPEL goes on to point out that if the Korean airline 007 was a provocation, as the evidence indicates, it is one of scope, ruthlessness, and boldness, even beyond the conceptions normal to healthy people. To let such an act pass in silence would be to leave the power to commit the country to general war in the hands of the people whose steadiness and judgment appear to be gravely flawed. Now we're putting our missiles in Europe, in Sicily, in Germany, in Great Britain. We are getting for World War III. We are putting our hands in people who are not normal. They're not healthy. But if you allow them to do this, then you have to go down on a ship that sinks with them. What can you do as individuals? Well, one thing you might do, if you don't want all the girly pictures, get the article that's coming out in Hustler on the 007. And if you want to write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I will send copies of this article to you if you don't mind all the underlining. I should have copied it and then underlined it, but when I read with the pen. And put these two side by side and maybe send them to news people and to radio announcers and to people riding around the country or talking around the country or writing articles around the country, and send it to Ted Koppel and Nightline or send it to 60 Minutes. Send the copy of the article on the 007. It's pretty clear, and I like it. I work hard on the things I write. I work hard before I write them, and I like it. And then send a self-addressed stamped envelope. Copy the Hustler article without all the girly pictures. If it turns your audience off, it may turn some on. Get your article, put this with it, and send these out. Something should be done and can be done on a lot of these issues. And here is somebody, not a Mae Brussell sitting here figuring it out alone, but a man who worked for the system all those years, who's warning you about what's coming down. Now we just have about 10 or 11 minutes, and I have a few one-liners that pile up. I have about 300 at home, but I'll share some of them with you because I don't want to lose some of the news stories. This week, Ronald Reagan talks of Star War ideas. They say new Reagan talks on Star Wars. He will meet with the national security advisors to make the first of the decisions on whether to use high-tech weapons in space. He decided that when he was still going to the University of Illinois. I can't believe that this is any new Reagan. This is Daniel Graham of the High Frontier, the partner of Fritz Kramer, Kissinger's mentor, our dear Fritz Kramer, and they will tell him that he needs the weapons for war, that NASA needs them. This isn't a new Reagan at all. This isn't a Reagan that just happens to come along and say, we need Star Wars. This is something they plan to put him on. This is what Werner von Braun planned, Mr. Dornberger planned, and all the top people in government from the German hierarchy that came to this country, that if you control the space, you control the world. Another story from the LA Times this last week, this was from the Chronicle. Navy ships refitted for nuclear survival. We are going to shock test everything you would like with a watch when we put them together and test them. They said the new class of destroyers the Navy wants to build will cost $1 billion each. That's $100 million each. And for the first time, they'll have survivability features. Called the Arleigh Burke class, these guided missile destroyers will be built without aluminum. In 1976, the aluminum superstructure sagged during a fire in the Mediterranean. So Vice Admiral Robert Walters, the Chief of Naval Operations under John Lehman, Secretary of Navy, the lackey of Henry Kissinger and company, and National Security Advisor Brzezinski and Fritz Kramer, working with that gang, want to make a 6-year program of carriers that they will build that will survive a nuclear war. They expect a nuclear war, and so they're going to make the ships for $100 million each, so that if you hit them, they won't sink in a nuclear war. Can you imagine such a thing? When you land on shore, what do you have? But another $100 million gone down the drain. The latest taking of gold in London, $37.5 million of pure gold. A warehouse near Heathrow Airport. It wasn't too long ago, 1963, the great train robbery of Otto Skorzeny, where the money went down to Brazil and the Nazis in South America. The robbery at Nice that had to do with agents of the CIA and the Nazi Galen network who took the money out of Nice. Now there's a robbery of gold out of London, a huge amount. Remember the $60 million that Mr. Saxon disposed of that was coming from Canada, people in Canada buying $60 million worth of gold that was supposed to be in Utah that went directly to Brazil, to some mysterious people in Brazil. Well, this story on the London gold says that it was destined for shipment to the Far East. This gold was stolen along with $150,000 worth of cut and uncut diamonds. So a few people nicely come along, so you get $60 million of gold, and then you get another $37 million. So that's $97 million. Remember, John DeLorean had $20 million worth of cocaine and was going to make $60 million. So if you take $97 million and you start growing weed somewhere of heroin or poppy or cocaine, you can imagine what this is going to be worth. Another very serious problem, having to do with cocaine, having to do with Henry Kissinger. This is the first time I've seen a coup advertised, but Hermann Zuazo, Z-U-A-Z-O, is the head of Bolivia. The last 13 months, he has been the elected head of Bolivia. They're planning a coup in 3 weeks. He's supposed to go to Argentina for the inauguration of the new president. I don't know why he would go. This is sort of like Mr. Bishop taking a trip and Mr. Cord takes over the island. So when he comes back, there's no more Grenada. The people that worked with Henry Kissinger and Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia want to get back in the cocaine business. Ex-General Hugo Banzer, B-A-N-Z-E-R, and various members of the military forces are plotting to take over. It's a right-wing counter-coup. They say there's some leftists, but you know what these leftists are. They're like the leftists in Grenada that turn out to work with the CIA and our Defense Department. That's how left they are. Or with Dr. Peter Bourne or Mr. Pastor. What was a leftist revolution turned Grenada right into a total police state with its computers and police. So these officers are getting ready to get back in the narcotics trade. It was a fluke that Klaus Barbie was caught. These are his co-workers, and maybe they'll spring Klaus Barbie like they did Licio Gelli out of the Swiss bank and never have him go to trial because it would embarrass the French. But they're advertising that there will be a coup in 3 weeks, and I suppose after Maurice Bishop was murdered, the next one, and Mr. Aquino was murdered. You can see Mr. Zuazo on television. Incidentally, a fellow that held the gun to Aquino's head just stood up and pointed at this week and unloaded a gun and said, "This is how I shot Aquino." Wouldn't it be nice if somebody just got up and said, "This is the way I killed John Kennedy. I stood here either in the sewer, the place underneath the ground, or over by the fence, and this is where I blew his head off." I think it makes good theater to just see a man showing you exactly how he did, then what are you going to do with him? They don't have any more commissions. The people just stand up. It's show and tell. Well, there's going to be another coup in Bolivia. Cocaine is king. The Nazis will be back in power. The army will be in power. It was Mr. General Hugo Banzar who used Klaus Barbie's death squads to keep him into power. It was a fluke that these 13 months existed. So now you become shock-proof. You understand this will be around Christmas, and you won't have time to think about that coup. Maybe one of the most important in history going on today. But we'll be opening and closing or wrapping or baking or doing something. So we won't have time when his head is blown off and the CIA takes over without any interruption, the Klaus Barbie Banzer network down in Bolivia. It's truly tragic that they even advertise what they're doing now. There's no more shocks. You don't have to wake up to know who's going to be killed next. And then pretty soon they'll get Castro and Gaddafi and wipe out the opposition, Arafat, and then the armbands will be moving. Incidentally, I was in Los Angeles at the Rebel office, Larry Flint's office, when two people were in the office talking to the gentleman who runs the magazine, if it's going to continue. And they were talking. They told me not to mention their names because I recognized one of them and was familiar with his nefarious works. And he said, "Don't tell anybody I was here." Well, for the moment, we won't. I don't want to be blown off the planet Earth, so I won't tell you who he was. But he had in his pocket, one of them had a little doll about 6, 8 inches high, and I guess, I don't know, he picked up on Fairfax. And it's a little rabbi with a yarmulke and his tallis and his beard. And he pulls it out of the bag, and he's dangling around the office. I said, "What's this?" He says, "Oh, this is to hang the rabbi." And I said, "Pardon me." And he said, "Yeah, this is to hang the rabbi." I said, "Can I have it? My father's a rabbi, and I don't appreciate this." And then the other person who I recognized, and as I say, with a nefarious career, reaches into his little suitcase, you see, this is a publication office, and pulls out a Luftwaffe hat with the swastika on it. That's what I mean by coming back to my little secure world in Carmel, where I don't have to meet these people and see them face to face, but that's the real world, just like the young guy who's studying for the FBI is the real world. So anyway, he showed me his hat, and then they told me that in their case they had these tape recordings, I guess, on how to round up Jews and kill rabbis and hang them. And they're not allowed in this country, but, you know, you can make 1,000 of them in 1 hour with the electronic equipment in Hollywood and elsewhere. And they had these tape cassettes on what to do. I suppose if they plan enough problems or terror at the Olympic Games and the czar of computers is busy, Mr. Inman in Austin, Texas, and the powers that be, the Western Golds, have their offices rolling in garages around the country, the hats will come out and the armbands will come out and the little dolls will be dangling on the back of the car on nooses. So that's the real world. The FBI, young guy who's going to join the FBI and lie if somebody's murdered and not tell you how many bullets, and hang the rabbi, that's the game, the name of the game down in Los Angeles. I bring this up because the coups are happening fast and furious, and I do think one of the ways nobody's going to do it to stop the cocaine kings is to just cold turkey stop all drugs. That's ridiculous. I'm asking for the impossible. That's not going to happen. But that would be one way to stop their power. Also in the newspaper, the Los Angeles Herald this week, Jesuits' new leader warns them to stay out of partisan politics. As I say, it's only 1 year since the scandals of the Vatican with the gun running and the Banco Ambrosiano and the narcotics traffic coming out of Milan headquarters. And the Pope appointed a new Jesuit priest. You're not supposed to appoint one until the other one dies. But the former Jesuit priest was too liberal, so they brought in the Reverend Peter Hans Kolvenbach. Is that Dutch enough for you? Kolvenbach. And he's telling the Jesuits around the world, just shut your mouth and behave yourselves and don't get into politics. Only Lech Walesa can get into politics. You can't do good politics. You have to be a fascist. That's not politics. That's religion. And do I sound bitter? Of course. Another story on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, Robert Kennedy's plan to keep LBJ out of the Oval Office. You saw how that succeeded. It says he didn't want his brother to take him as vice president, and he did. And within hours of Kennedy's death, LBJ was in the office taking over the president's desk and seat. And Bobby Kennedy hoped there was some way to keep him out of office. If Bobby Kennedy had done his homework and traced some of the corpses around Texas and the blackmailing votes that LBJ had, he wouldn't have allowed his brother to become president and select Robert Kennedy as vice president. It's really dangerous to have people like that as your vice president, as you know. And, of course, Robert Kennedy never even lived past the California primary. They took care of that very quickly. You've got to move swiftly. If you don't like the guy, the other side just simply kills him. They move so fast they kill him. You can't be hypothetical and theoretical because all the documents can show that you don't like the guy. But if you choose him as your vice president, you have to like him. You can't pick on him because you selected him, and that is very fatal. In fact, Medford Evans of the John Birch Society wrote about Robert Kennedy and the assassination, his assassination. It said he may have agreed, Johnson, not to run in 1968, but he didn't agree not to play cowboy and Indian, and it's lethal to play with Lyndon Johnson, rather. That was Medford Evans, in American Opinion, telling it right from the horse's mouth, that it's fatal to play cowboy and Indian with Lyndon Johnson, and that's what Robert Kennedy tried to do, and you know the rest is history. Well, we got about 20 seconds here, so I'm going to sign off and tell you to have a good week and do your homework. I'll be back with you. Try and get the Rebel if you can. Next week, the article on the 07 will be out with the Hustler, and I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell, KAZU FM, isn't it? Pacific Grove, California. Bye-bye.
Hi, Mae.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.